They weren't just women with dark secrets. They were masterminds hiding in plain sight. But behind the facades were stories so twisted, they left entire nations stunned. These women walked free for years, deceiving, manipulating, and destroying lives, until the truth finally caught up with them. Josephine Iyamu. She wore a nurse's badge in London, but ruled like a cult leader in West Africa. Josephine Iyamu didn't just prey on women, she psychologically imprisoned them. Behind her professional image was a trafficker who used ancient spiritual fear to fuel her criminal empire. Operating between Nigeria and Europe, Iyamu recruited poor women with promises of a better life abroad. But the path she offered wasn't paved with hope, it was soaked in horror. Before being smuggled into Germany, her victims were forced into horrifying juju rituals. These weren't symbolic ceremonies. The women were made to eat raw chicken hearts, drink concoctions mixed with worms and blood, and have powder rubbed into open wounds. All of it done to bind them to Iyamu through fear. The women were forced to swear they'd repay massive debts, amounts that grew once they arrived in Europe. In Germany, they were pushed into prostitution, with the threat of spiritual retaliation hanging over their heads if they disobeyed or tried to flee. Josephine Iyamu, originally born in Liberia and later granted British citizenship due to her nursing credentials, thought she was untouchable. She was wrong. In a landmark case at Birmingham Crown Court, she was found guilty of 5 counts of arranging or facilitating travel for exploitation, becoming the first British citizen convicted under the expanded Modern Slavery Act. But her attempts to escape justice didn't stop there. Iyamu was also convicted of perverting the course of justice. She tried to use her influence, her lies, and even her connections to wiggle out of the law's grip. This wasn't a case of survival. It was calculated cruelty, power, and profit at the cost of human lives. In public, she lived modestly. She reported earning just over 14,000 euros a year as an NHS agency nurse. But behind the curtain, she lived like a queen, owning a large home in Benin City and flying across continents with ease. The money came from the women she trafficked, women who were too terrified to resist. Iyamu had recruited a voodoo priest to carry out brutal juju ceremonies. Victims were forced to participate in rituals meant to spiritually bind them to Iyamu, with threats of death or madness if they disobeyed. Their families back home were also at risk if the women refused to pay the tens of thousands of euros Iyamu demanded. The journey from Nigeria to Germany was deadly. Iyamu knew that. She didn't care. Prosecutors said she was willing to risk their lives for profit. And when some of the women finally found the courage to speak, they exposed the full extent of her manipulation. Iyamu was initially sentenced to 14 years in prison at Birmingham Crown Court in 2018, but her crimes were too severe for that to stand. The Court of Appeal later extended her sentence to 18 years. A message was sent. She wasn't above the law, and her days of exploiting fear for fortune were over. Lydia Mugambe. And then comes the woman who was well respected in society but behind closed doors, a complete monster. Lydia Mugambe was a United Nations judge and a respected high court official in Uganda. But behind the title, beneath the robes, she was hiding a dark secret. In the UK, far away from the courtroom, she was forcing a young woman to live as her slave. While publicly studying law at Oxford University, Mugambe was privately running what prosecutors described as a calculated exploitative scheme. The victim, a young woman from Uganda, had no steady employment, no freedom, and no idea of the rights she was entitled to. Mugambe made sure of that. She used her position, her legal knowledge, and her connections to strip the woman of agency, forcing her to clean the house and care for children without a penny in return. And she didn't act alone. Prosecutors revealed that Mugambe conspired with Uganda's Deputy High Commissioner, John Leonard Mugerwa, to arrange the woman's travel under false pretenses. It was a trade-off. Mugerwa helped get the woman into the UK by exploiting diplomatic channels, and in return, Mugambe would try to sway a legal case he was involved in. When authorities finally caught up to Mugambe, she seemed stunned. In police footage, she clung to her status, even going as far as saying that, "I am a judge in my country. I even have immunity. I am not a criminal," she said. But that immunity didn't hold. The courtroom gasped when the guilty verdicts were read. Mugambe was convicted of conspiracy to breach immigration law, facilitating travel for exploitation, forced labor, and attempting to intimidate the victim into dropping charges. Despite her polished image, the court heard that Mugambe's real motive was disturbingly simple. In their exact words, they said, to obtain someone to make her life easier at the least possible cost to herself. She denied everything, insisting she had always treated the young woman with love and patience. But her victim, alone, isolated, and unpaid, told a different story. She described feeling lonely and stuck, trapped in a foreign country with no freedom and no way out. Even after the police got involved, Mugambe didn't stop trying to shield herself. She repeatedly invoked diplomatic immunity, insisting her status as a UN judge protected her from prosecution. "I have a diplomatic passport," she told the arresting officer. But the UN saw it differently. The Office of the Secretary General formally waived her immunity, clearing the way for justice to be served. Incredibly, Mugambe had been appointed to the UN's judicial roster just months after police were first called to her home. A woman who had risen to global legal heights, who once handed down rulings on human rights, was now guilty of violating them behind closed doors. Jemiker Thompson. In a case of rising to power, we have Jemiker Thompson. Born into poverty, she knew struggle long before she ever knew power. Evicted from her home as a young girl, she grew up with a deep, gnawing fear of being broke, a fear that would one day drive her into the darkest corners of Los Angeles's drug underworld. In the beginning, she was just another kid on the block, young, desperate, and invisible, in a city tearing itself apart during the crack epidemic. But when she met Anthony Mosley, everything changed. Older, experienced, and deeply entrenched in the drug trade, Mosley saw something in Jemiker. Together they weren't just a couple, they were a business, and that business was booming. They made real money selling substances, but it wasn't long before crack hit LA like wildfire. It was fast, cheap, addictive, and extremely profitable. Jemiker and Mosley pivoted quickly. Soon they weren't just making a living, they were building an empire. But in the drug game, success always paints a target on your back. One afternoon, while washing his car, Mosley was shot and killed. Jemiker was shattered. But instead of backing out, she stepped up alone. As a young widow and mother, she took control of the business, scaled it further, and began running one of the largest crack operations in South Central. Her climb was relentless. Her network expanded. Her profits skyrocketed, but her enemies multiplied, and eventually, so did her mistakes. With Mosley gone, Jemiker Thompson didn't just survive, she thrived. She rebuilt her empire from the ground up, forging deeper connections across Los Angeles and tightening her grip on the crack trade. And soon she met a new ally, a man who went by the street name Cheese. Together they pushed her operation into new territory, bringing in more money, more power, and, unfortunately, more risk. But the street has no loyalty. When Cheese got arrested, he didn't hesitate. Faced with serious prison time, he flipped and gave Jemiker's name to the feds. Knowing the walls were closing in, Jemiker vanished. She left LA and went on the run for 5 years, slipping through law enforcement's fingers while raising her son in the shadows. For a while, it worked. But the life she left behind would eventually catch up with her in the most heartbreaking way. In 1993, she returned to Los Angeles for a moment no mother would want to miss, her son's 6th grade graduation. But the moment she showed up, the U.S. Marshals were waiting. In front of her son, in front of his classmates, Jemiker Thompson was arrested. She was sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal prison. And this is when her story takes a turn for the better. Behind bars, she found faith, peace, and purpose. By the time she walked free, she was no longer the queenpin of crack. She was a woman on a mission. Today, Jemiker runs her own ministry, helping others escape the very darkness she once ruled. Patricia Russa. Patricia Russa was only 21 when she made a choice that would ruin lives and end one. It started with a knock on the front door of a quiet home in Daytona Beach, Florida. On the other side stood Patricia and her boyfriend, Cornelius Baker. When 56-year-old Elizabeth Uptigraft opened the door, she probably assumed it was nothing more than a stranger needing help. What happened next was nothing short of a nightmare. The couple struck her on the head and stormed inside, taking both Elizabeth and her son hostage. But it didn't stop there. Patricia helped ransack the house before forcing Elizabeth into her own car. They drove off, leaving behind chaos, fear, and a stunned son. Hours later, Elizabeth's lifeless body was found dumped near a dirt road, shot multiple times. Investigators quickly pieced together the horrific plot. It wasn't a random act, it was a cold-blooded plan to rob, kidnap, and kill. At trial, Patricia faced the consequences of her decisions. She was found guilty of first-degree felony murder, armed kidnapping, home invasion robbery, and more. Her partner in crime, Baker, was sentenced to death. Patricia? She now faces a mandatory life sentence. No second chances. For years, she walked free, but now the door she once knocked on has slammed shut behind her, forever. Crystal Mangum. Crystal Mangum's name first exploded across national headlines in 2006, but not for murder. At the time, she accused members of the Duke University lacrosse team of SA, launching a media firestorm that swept across the country. The story wasn't just about alleged SA. It was a powder keg of race, privilege, gender, and power. Mangum, a black woman and an exotic dancer. The players were wealthy white men at a top university. For months, the case fueled outrage. But there was one problem. None of it was true. Years later, in 2024, Mangum finally admitted she had made it all up. She said she wanted validation, attention, anything to feel seen. But by then, her name was already tied to one of the most controversial, false accusations in modern history. That could have been the end of it. But Crystal's life kept spiraling. In 2010, police were called to her home after she lit her boyfriend's clothes on fire during a violent argument with her young daughter in the house. Though she was arrested on multiple charges, including attempted murder and harm involving a minor, she avoided serious prison time. But the warning signs were loud, and they were getting louder. In 2011, Mangum stabbed her next boyfriend, Reginald Day. He died 10 days later. This time she claimed self-defense, but forensic evidence and Day's final words told a different story. He was trying to get away when she stabbed him. In 2013, Mangum was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to up to 17 years in prison. Her violent past didn't just play out in court. It became the subject of several true crime TV shows. She appeared in a jailhouse interview for Wives with Knives in 2012, and her story was later covered in Fatal Attraction and Snapped. Even ESPN's 30 for 30 documentary Fantastic Lies revisited her role in the infamous Duke case. From national headlines to TV screens, Crystal Mangum's name became synonymous with deceit, violence, and downfall. She once walked free, her lies nearly destroying lives. But today she sits behind bars, not for what she falsely claimed, but for what she truly did. Cyntoia Brown. Cyntoia Brown's case is one of the most debated and emotionally charged in recent American criminal justice history. At just 16 years old, Cyntoia was arrested for the murder and robbery of a man who, according to her, had paid to exploit her. Her early life paints a heartbreaking backdrop. Born in Kentucky to a mother who struggled with addiction, Cyntoia was adopted into a stable home. Yet her childhood was marked by instability, school dropouts, and run-ins with the law. By 2004, she was living on the streets of Nashville and had fallen into the hands of a violent man who trafficked her. The trauma she endured before that night became a central part of her defense. Here is how it happened. On the night of August 6th, 2004, 16-year-old Cyntoia Brown encountered 43-year-old Johnny Michael Allen in the parking lot of a Sonic drive-in in Nashville, Tennessee. Allen was known in the community as a real estate agent, a church volunteer, and a youth mentor. A detective involved in the case later reported that Allen offered Cyntoia food and asked if she was open to spending time with him. Cyntoia accepted, and the two went to his home after ordering dinner. During court proceedings, Cyntoia stated she had agreed to engage in a transactional relationship, but claimed they never followed through. Allen's acquaintances strongly disputed any inappropriate intent, saying he had a history of trying to help those in need. However, the lead prosecutor publicly stated that Allen had in fact picked Cyntoia up with her consent. Additional testimony came from a teen server at a local restaurant who said Allen often made her and other young workers uncomfortable due to his behavior. During their intimate time together at his home, Cyntoia shot Allen in the head with a firearm she had been carrying. She then took cash, 2 guns, and left in his vehicle, which she later abandoned in a Walmart parking lot. She returned to her motel with the help of a third party. Authorities located and arrested her shortly afterward. In a later letter opposing Cyntoia's clemency, a detective stated that a witness claimed Cyntoia had returned to the Walmart the next day with the intent to go back to Allen's residence to retrieve more items. The same witness reportedly said Cyntoia made remarks suggesting the incident was motivated by financial gain. Cyntoia allegedly also made a threatening call to the individual after learning he had discussed the situation with someone else. Cyntoia faced multiple charges and was tried as an adult, a decision made by Judge Betty Adams Green, who deemed the case too serious for juvenile court. Cyntoia admitted to the shooting but maintained it was an act of self-protection. She described feeling unsafe and claimed Allen made gestures that led her to believe he might harm her. However, no weapon belonging to Allen was recovered, and he was found in a resting position. Prosecutors argued that Cyntoia's actions were premeditated and driven by intent to rob rather than fear. Cyntoia Brown was found guilty of first-degree murder, felony murder, and aggravated robbery. She received a life sentence. She was held at the Deborah K. Johnson Rehabilitation Center in Nashville, Tennessee. Under the terms of her original sentence, she would not have been eligible for parole until she was 60 years old. But her story takes a turn for her own good. While behind bars, Cyntoia was set